I'm just gonna say what a lot of people are quietly thinking, but nobody in the mainstream conversation wants to fully commit to. The Cleveland Browns don't actually have a quarterback competition right now. They have a formality, a performance, a process that looks like an open race on the surface but has an answer already buried underneath it. And the longer you watch what's coming out of Berea, the more obvious that answer becomes. The real question isn't who wins. The real question is whether this organization has the nerve to do what the evidence is demanding. Let me break this down the right way, because there's a lot more happening beneath the surface than the headlines are capturing. Herm Edwards got on with Adam the Bull recently, and what he said stopped me cold. Not because he was loud about it, not because he was performing for the camera. He was calm, deliberate, measured, the way someone talks when they've actually lived through enough football to know exactly what they're looking at. And when the conversation turned to Deshaun Watson, Herm used two words that I haven't been able to get out of my head since. He said Watson is fighting for his survival. That's it. That's the phrase. Fighting for survival. Now I need you to really sit with that for a moment, because 6 years ago, not even that long ago, Deshaun Watson was considered one of the most dynamic, most dangerous quarterbacks in professional football. He was the kind of player that franchises mortgage their futures to acquire. He was the kind of player Cleveland believed was their answer to a decade of suffering at the position. And the word being used to describe where he stands today is survival. Think about how far that has traveled. Think about the distance between those two realities. But here's where Herm's conversation gets genuinely important, because he didn't just stop at Watson. Adam pushed back with something that I think is the cleanest, most honest framing of this entire situation that anyone has offered. He said, even if you set aside everything else, even if Watson somehow defies every expectation and actually plays decent football this year, it doesn't matter. He's gone regardless. The financial architecture of that contract makes it structurally impossible for Cleveland to bring him back. So you play him, he plays reasonably well, and then what? You've bought yourself some wins with a quarterback who has no future in that building. And meanwhile, the guy you've already told the world your future belongs to is sitting on the sideline, not developing, not growing, not building the reps and the chemistry and the internal confidence that young quarterbacks need. Adam's logic isn't complicated. It's just honest. And I think it reflects what a lot of real Browns fans are actually feeling when they get quiet and strip away the noise. Now Todd Monken's position in all of this, that's more layered, and Herm acknowledged it fairly. Because Monken isn't walking into some comfortable, established situation. He is a first-year head coach. He has spent his entire career as a coordinator, building offenses, waiting for the opportunity to run his own program. And he's arriving in a moment where the seat is already warm before he's coached a single regular season snap. That's a brutal reality. When a head coach's job security feels fragile from day one, the temptation to prioritize immediate wins over long-term vision becomes very real. If Watson gives him a better chance in week 3 or week 7, the human instinct to protect yourself kicks in. Herm was honest about that. He said Monken has real obligations to his players, to ownership, to producing results in a league that doesn't extend patience generously. But then Herm said the thing that I think matters most in this entire conversation. He said you cannot fool the players. You just cannot do it. These men are in that building together every single morning. They're watching film together. They're running routes together. They're in the weight room and the lunchroom and the hallways. They see every throw, every decision, every hesitation under pressure in a Wednesday walkthrough that the outside world will never hear about. A coach can stand at a podium and talk about competition all he wants. The players have already formed their verdict before training camp ends, and once that verdict is formed, no press conference changes it. The locker room already knows. They always know. And what they see with their own eyes every single day determines whether they trust the people running their program or whether they start quietly questioning everything. And that is where this stops being a football evaluation and starts being a test of leadership character. Because if Monken knows his players are watching, and he absolutely knows because he's been in NFL buildings long enough to understand how this works, then he also knows that the quarterback decision he makes will define his authority in that locker room before October arrives. The wrong call, made for the wrong reasons, doesn't just cost you football games, it costs you the room. And I've watched enough NFL coaching tenures collapse silently because a head coach lost the room before the real pressure even arrived. Herm has lived through that. The warning he was delivering wasn't casual, it was earned. Now add Myles Garrett into this picture, and the conversation shifts into something else entirely. The best defensive player on Cleveland's roster, one of the most respected presences in that entire building, a man who has stayed through the losing and the dysfunction and the disappointment and has chosen to remain a Brown when he probably had reasons not to. Myles Garrett went on record and told the world that in his view, Shedeur Sanders is the guy. He said Shedeur was the last player off the field at the end of last season. Think carefully about what that means. When the franchise cornerstone, the defensive anchor of your team, the player whose credibility inside that locker room is essentially unquestioned, makes a statement like that publicly, that is not a throwaway comment. That is the locker room speaking directly through its most trusted voice. And if the coaching staff makes a decision that directly contradicts what Myles Garrett has already said without legitimate football justification, the fracture that creates doesn't disappear quietly. It festers. Let me get into the money, because I think this part of the conversation deserves more direct attention than it typically gets. Deshaun Watson's cap hit this year is $44 million. $44 million. That number exists whether he plays 16 games, whether he plays 0, whether he gets hurt in the first quarter of Week 1 and never takes another snap. That money is committed. It is gone. And because of the way the original contract was structured, the void years that were used to create cap space at the time of the deal, the dead money connected to Watson extends beyond this season. Cleveland is financially tethered to this situation in ways that reach forward into years they're already trying to plan around. On the other side of that ledger sits Shedeur Sanders and his rookie contract, roughly $4.6 million. That is the comparison. $44 million of sunk cost sitting on one side, and $4.6 million of genuine developmental upside sitting on the other. If you're Jimmy Haslam thinking like a businessman, and Jimmy Haslam is very much a businessman, you don't defend sunk costs. You don't keep pouring resources into a decision that has already revealed its outcome. You identify where real future value exists, and you commit to it. The math in this situation is not subtle. Now here's where I want to slow down and spend some real time, because I think this is the part of the argument that too many people are rushing past. Beyond the contracts, beyond the locker room signals, beyond everything Herm laid out, there is a genuine, legitimate, analytically grounded football case for Shedeur Sanders in 2026. And it's not built on hope, it's built on real evidence, and I want to walk through it carefully. Start with what Shedeur was actually dealing with last year. The Browns' offensive line wasn't just struggling, it was among the worst units in the entire league. He was facing pressure on approximately half of his dropbacks as a rookie. Half. You are a first-year quarterback trying to process NFL defensive schemes, which are genuinely nothing like what college prepares you for in terms of disguise, complexity, and timing. And on half of your snaps, you have defenders in your face before your second read even registers. That is not a learning environment. That is a survival environment. And the fact that Shedeur still showed moments of real processing ability, genuine footwork adjustments under pressure, and the competitive stubbornness to keep working through his reads in those conditions, that tells you something meaningful about what he's actually made of underneath the struggles. Now look at what Cleveland has done this offseason specifically in response to that. They spent significant draft capital on the offensive line. They spent money in free agency to address the trenches in a deliberate, focused way. The honest projection isn't that this line suddenly becomes elite. That would be an overstatement. But middle of the road is a real expectation. And here's what people undervalue when they hear that. Moving from bottom 3 in the NFL to genuinely average in front of a developing quarterback is not a modest upgrade. That extra half second, that additional moment before the pocket collapses, it changes what's possible. Decisions that were impossible last year become manageable. Throws that ended in incompletions or worse suddenly become the kind of completions that build rhythm and confidence across a full season. The investment in receivers matters too. Cleveland went hard at that position in the draft. Jerry Jeudy is back, and what Jeudy said about Todd Monken's offense was striking in its directness. Jeudy has operated inside multiple NFL systems. He knows the difference between a scheme that constrains what you can do and a scheme that genuinely unlocks it. And his characterization of Monken's approach wasn't a polite compliment. He said it was night and day. Those are strong words from a professional with real perspective on what that comparison actually means. Denzel Boston was describing something from inside the building that I think deserves more attention than it's gotten. He was talking about the complexity of what Monken is constructing at the play design level. Same formation, identical motion, completely different concept underneath. When I heard that, I immediately understood why this offense is going to give defensive coordinators problems all season. Think about what that means for a defense that has spent the week preparing tendencies. Your safeties have been drilled to rotate a specific way when they see a certain motion. Your corners have been told to pattern match off particular formations. Your entire preparation is built around reading triggers. And then Monken hits you with that same motion, that same formation, and an entirely different play concept underneath it. You've already committed to the wrong reaction. By the time the defense finishes processing what's actually happening, the matchup has already broken open somewhere on the field. This is the philosophical transformation that I think matters most when you're projecting what Shedeur Sanders can become. Under Kevin Stefanski, and I'll be fair here because Stefanski had genuine strengths, the offensive philosophy was fundamentally conservative. Get the ball out fast, short routes, quick decisions, manage risk by eliminating exposure before pressure arrives. That framework can function when your running game is dominant and your defense is winning games. But it does not develop a quarterback. It does not build a dynamic passing offense. It puts a ceiling on what's achievable. And Shedeur Sanders has the arm talent, the football processing ability, and the competitive instinct to operate inside something far more demanding and far more rewarding than that. Monken wants his quarterback seeing something at the line of scrimmage and having the authority to change the play. He wants aggressive decision-making. He wants the ball traveling downfield when the matchup is right. When your receiver gets isolated one-on-one on the outside, Monken wants his quarterback looking there and throwing with conviction. That kind of trust, the trust a head coach places in his quarterback's real-time judgment, is exactly how an offense becomes genuinely difficult to defend. It's also how a young quarterback builds the internal belief that carries him through the rough moments in a long NFL season, because there is a profound difference between a signal caller executing someone else's script and one who is actually operating with real authority on every single snap. The probability estimate I heard put Shedeur performing above average this year at around 40%. And it was reached through real reasoning, not fan optimism. My honest reaction when I heard it was that 40% feels conservative. Not because I've abandoned analytical thinking, but because when you actually stack all of it together, the offensive line upgrade, the weapons investment, the schematic advantages Monken is engineering, and the development trajectory Shedeur was already on despite those genuinely brutal conditions last year, 50% or better feels like the more honest number. The second-year leap argument carries real historical weight too. Young quarterbacks make jumps. It's not automatic, but it is a documented pattern across NFL history, and the conditions surrounding that leap matter enormously. Harold Fanning entering his sophomore year as a primary receiving target. Jordan Jenkins coming off injury and reportedly looking explosive and meaningfully faster in camp. Jonathan Mingo and Antoine Jr. now carrying a full year of NFL experience into their development. None of these players have established anything at the highest level yet. I want to be clear about that. But the trajectory across this roster is pointing upward, and upward trajectory combined with a stronger offensive line and a more sophisticated scheme is exactly the environment where above-average quarterback play gets created. What Shedeur himself said about the learning process is what landed hardest for me personally. He described those first days of rookie minicamp. Everything foreign, everything overwhelming, the playbook feeling like a different language. And then he described what started shifting. They began running the same plays out of different formations, different motions. The underlying philosophy started clicking. Every day felt more natural than the one before. The study habits were developing into a genuine rhythm. He said he was finding his groove in how to prepare. That is not a quarterback treading water. That is a quarterback installing roots, building an internal foundation. And if you know what to look for, if you've watched enough young players come through the league to recognize the difference between one who is surviving a system and one who is actually internalizing it, Shedeur's description sounds unmistakably like the latter. The moment those concepts stop feeling like external information to be processed and start feeling like instinct is the moment you see what a quarterback truly is. And everything coming out of that building from the players who are actually inside it suggests Monken's system is accelerating that process faster than anyone expected. When you pull all of this together and look at it honestly, every thread is pointing in the same direction. The financial reality points one way. The locker room dynamics that Herm Edwards laid out, the ones that can't be managed or spun or overcome with a press conference, point the same way. The offensive infrastructure Cleveland has been deliberately constructing around this quarterback position points that way. The philosophical shift from conservative risk management to aggressive scheme-based advantages points that way. The voices of the players who are in that building every morning, including the most credible voice on the entire roster, point that way. I understand the pressure on Todd Monken. I genuinely do. He is a first-year head coach with no runway for error and no ownership group that has learned patience through success. But the decision sitting in front of him isn't actually complicated when you remove the noise and the fear from the equation. Play the quarterback your future belongs to. Trust the evidence your players are delivering every single day in practice. Respect the investment you've already made in building a scheme and a roster specifically designed to develop a young passer. And understand that the locker room credibility you need to establish as a head coach, the kind that carries you through adversity and keeps a team together when games get hard, lives or dies on whether you have the conviction to follow the evidence honestly. For Cleveland fans, I think what makes this specific moment feel genuinely different from every other false dawn in recent memory is that the logic actually aligns for the first time in a long time. The scheme fits the quarterback. The weapons, while unproven, carry real upside. The offensive line is no longer an impossible obstacle that makes fair evaluation meaningless. The coaching staff has a philosophy that actually matches who they're working with, and the quarterback himself is showing exactly the growth markers you want from a young player absorbing a complex system under real pressure. None of that is a guarantee. Football doesn't do guarantees. But the conditions being assembled in Berea right now are the kind of conditions that real contender windows actually get built from. What happens next is going to say everything about whether this organization has genuinely changed, or whether it's still reaching for the comfort of the familiar when the harder, better choice is sitting right there in front of them.